G'day everyone, my name's Jesse O'Hara and today I'm going to do a short presentation on the economic history of my favourite of the Asian tigers, South Korea. Now when you talk about the history of a country's economy, political system, social system, you could really go in lots of different directions and speak for a long time. So for the purpose of today's presentation, I'm going to break it down into 4 key sections which I think are the most important. The first section I'm going to talk about is the Chosun Dynasty and the Malthusian trap. The second section I'm going to talk about is the colonization of Korea by Japan. The third section I'm going to talk about is the end of World War II and the separation of the two Koreas and the Korean War. The fourth and final section I'm going to talk about the modernisation of Korea and how I like to refer as the South Korean miracle. Section number 1. The Chosun Dynasty and the Malthusian trap. The Chosun Dynasty lasted from 1392 to 1910, and during this long period of time, the Malthusian trap strangled Korea. You might be wondering, what's the Malthusian trap? And I was the same thing too. The Malthusian trap is a term coined by political economist Thomas Robert Malthus. And he stated that for most of human history, income was largely stagnant. Even when there was technological advances and discoveries, these led to more people rather than higher standards of living. Many countries are still stuck in the Malthusian trap today actually, such as lots of countries in tropical Africa. So Korea was stuck in this Malthusian trap for a very long time during the Chosun Dynasty. Initially, the dynasty imposed a tribute system on a little commercialised peasant economy, collecting taxes in the form of a variety of products, mobilising labour to obtain handicrafts and services if needed. From the late 16th century to the early 17th century, invading armies from Japan and China shattered this command system and forced a transition to a market economy. The damaged bureaucracy started to receive taxes in money, commodities, rice, cotton, textiles, and eventually began to mint copper coins and lifted restrictions on trade. The wars also dealt a serious blow to slavery and the pre-war system of forced labour, allowing labour markets to emerge. Markets were slow to develop. Grain markets in agricultural regions of Korea appeared way less integrated than those of similar regions in Japan and China. So a very high inefficiency happening there. The population increased massively after these wars, up until about 1800. And this is where a century of demographic stagnation followed due to high levels of mortality. During the 19th century, living standards appeared to deteriorate even more. Both wages and rents fell, tax receipts shrank, and budget deficits expanded, forcing the government to resort to dismemberment. Peasant rebellions occurred more frequently and poor peasants left Korea for northern China. Given that both acreage and population remained stable during the 19th century, the worsening living standards imply that aggregate output contracted because land and labour were being used even in a more inefficient way. The decline in efficiency had much to do with a disintegrating system of water control, which included flood control and irrigation. During the 19th century, there was an exodus of workers out of the agricultural industry and into handicraft and commercial industries. The water control problem affected primarily rice farming productivity. During the 19th century, paddy land prices fell while dry farm prices increased. Peasants and landlords converted their paddy crops into dry farms during the 19th century, and then occurred an exodus of workers out of the agricultural industry altogether into handicrafts and commerce. Despite this proto-industrialization, late dynastic Korea remained well below Japan and well below China as far as living standards. Section number 2. Japanese colonial rule. 1876, very late in the Chosun Dynasty, Japan made its intentions very clear about Korea by forcing open the country for trade. After Japan defeated Russia in the War of 1905, Japan virtually annexed Korea, which was made official 5 years later in 1910. The feeble and predatory bureaucracy of the Chosun Dynasty was replaced by a developmental colonial state by the Japanese. Drawing in the experience from the powerful Japanese Meiji government, the colonial state introduced a set of expensive policies to modernise Korea. One important project was to improve the infrastructure of the country. Railway lines, roads, harbours, communication networks were all improved. This rapidly integrated the goods and factory markets, both nationally and internationally. Another project was a vigorous health campaign. The Japanese introduced modern medicine, they built hospitals, and this significantly dropped the mortality rate, which was mentioned earlier during the Chosun Dynasty. The mortality transition resulted in a population increase of about 1.4% per year, which was massive. The third project was to revamp education. Primary school enrolment rose from 1% in 1910 to 47% by the end of Japanese rule. The Japanese also legalised property rights to land, which boosted not only the efficiency in land use, but also tax revenue from the landowners. The colonial government implemented industrial policy as well. The Rice Production Development Program, a policy which was introduced after the rice riots in Japan, was aimed to increase the supply of rice within the Japanese Empire. There was a push for irrigation and water reservoirs after we saw during the Chosun period the wet crops were turned to dry land. So the Japanese pushed for this improvement on water reservoirs and irrigation so that the rice yield could increase, which did happen. The rice yield increased, which was also held to effect from the first fertilizer factory, which was built by the Japanese in 1927. Despite the rice program, the structure of the colonial economy wasn't just agriculture. It was actually shifting away from agriculture towards manufacturing, and since the beginning of the colonial rule, we saw a massive change from agriculture to manufacturing. From 1911 to 40, the share in manufacturing GDP increased from 6% to 28%, while agriculture fell from 76% down to 41% of GDP. However, much of the colonial power was loathed by the Koreans. They hated the Japanese, but it's hard to deny the improvements they saw. The institutional modernisation and technological distribution within the country, also the inflow of Japanese capital, really put an end to the Malthusian trap that we talked about and pushed Korea on the correct path towards economic growth. Rent and wages stopped falling and started to rise from the early 20th century. Consumption per capita increased due to rising non-grain and non-good consumption, and Koreans were also getting a better education than they were ever before. In the late 1920s, life expectancy at birth was 37 years for a Korean person. By the end of Japanese rule, that had jumped up to 43 years. Not too bad. Japan joined World War II in 1937 after invading China. And after being involved with such a long and devastating conflict, the colonial rule ended with the defeat of the Japanese in 1945. Section number 3. The separation of Korea and the Korean War. Firstly, I'd like to note that I've included this short period of Korea's history because it truly was a fundamental signpost along a colourful and winding road for the peninsula. With the end of the Second World War in 1945, the wartime allies, Russia and the USA, divided Korea along the 38th parallel, bang up in the middle. The US military government took over the southern half, known as South Korea, while the Russian Reds took over the north, to be known as North Korea. Although the story between the two Koreas is fascinating and seemingly never-ending to this day, I will be focusing the rest of my presentation on the South Korean nation. The fall of Japan, decolonisation and political division meant a sudden disruption of trade, both within Korea and with international partners, mainly Japan. And this caused a serious economic downturn. Dealing with this post-colonial chaos, the US military government provided South Korea with economic relief and privatised the properties previously owned by the Japanese government. The first South Korean government was established in 1948, 3 years after World War II, and they carried out a land reform, making land distribution more egalitarian. The government didn't have much time to stabilise before a major conflict was on its doorstep in 1950, when the Korean War broke out. The Korean War was the first military action of the Cold War between opposing idealistic juggernauts of the USSR and the USA. The effects of the war were devastating for South Korea. 1.5 million people perished and about a quarter of the capital's stock was destroyed during its 3-year duration. South Korea, a country of only 8 years old, born from a peninsula of great history and recent division, was brought to its knees. Section 4. The modernisation of South Korea and the Korean Miracle. After the war, which ended in a ceasefire, the South Korean government took a Keynesian approach to their economy. South Korean policymakers set upon stimulating economic growth by promoting homegrown industrial firms, following the example of many other countries after World War II. The government selected firms in target industries and gave them privileges to buy foreign currencies and to borrow funds from banks at lower rates. Tariffs were placed on imports with an aim at giving the homegrown manufacturers a chance to build. The father of modern South Korea, General Park Chung-hee, overthrew the short-lived Second Republic of Korea in a military coup in May 1961. Park Chung-hee's flagship strategy to stimulate growth was through export promotion. Export promotion was known as EP. Under EP, policymakers gave various types of favours, low interest loans being the most important to exporting firms according to their export performance. EP accelerated productivity by placing firms under the discipline of export markets and by widening the contact with the developed world. In the decade after EP was introduced, per capita output doubled and South Korea officially became an industrialised country. The agricultural share of GDP shrank from 45% down to 25%, while manufacturing rose from 9% up to 27% in 10 years up to 1970. Park Chung-hee instituted a government social institute named the Sejmal Institute, which stood for the New Community Movement. The Sejmal Institute helped transform the massive poverty that was strickening the rural districts by implementing infrastructure, education, leadership, teamwork initiatives so that they could develop. This institute was very, very successful in reaching out the urban areas into the rural, poorer areas. After the US coalition pulled out of Vietnam in 1975, South Korea grew more and more wary of their position in the communist region, although a major US military presence was still held in South Korea. So South Korea began producing more munitions, which saw the introductions of heavy and chemical industries to the country, diversifying their manufacturing capability. The government intervened heavily in the financial markets, directing banks to provide low-interest loans to the chaebols. The chaebols, they're conglomerates of businesses owned by or directed by a single family or person. Chaebols are the cornerstone of modern political, economic and social landscape of South Korea. Chaebols were selected for the task of developing these heavy chemical industries and were successful in rapidly expanding their capital-intensive industries within the South Korean economy. Park Chung-hee unfortunately was assassinated in 1979, putting a sudden end to his regime, which initiated an average annual increase of GDP of 8% from 1960 onwards. This graph shows the rapid rise in GDP of South Korea from 1960 onwards. It's incredible. The most significant factor during this rapid industrialization was the adoption of the outward-looking export promotion strategy, EP. This strategy was particularly well suited to that time because South Korea's poor natural resources, low savings rates, and tiny domestic market. The strategy promoted economic growth through labour-intensive manufactured exports in which South Korea could develop a competitive advantage. Early in the 80s, in order to control inflation, tight fiscal measures were adopted by the government. Also, government intervention in the economy was greatly reduced and policies on imports and foreign investment were liberalised to promote competition in the 80s. This trend was common for governments in the Thatcher era as the Hayek model of economics began to rear its head, where the Keynesian model had stood strong for most of the 20th century. The economy was booming. By the late 1980s, GDP growth was at a staggering 12.5%. For the first half of the 1990s, the South Korean economy continued to grow in both private consumption and GDP. Things were good. However, this changed quickly when the Asian financial crisis came bearing down upon South Korea in 1997. Several other Asian currencies were attacked by speculators. The Korean won started to depreciate heavily by October 1997. By December, the IMF and the US had put together a loan of close to $90 billion to bail out Korea. And the government ended up closing a third of the merchant banks. It was a pretty bad situation. Throughout 1998, Korea's economy would continue to shrink quarterly at an average of negative 6.5%. Actions by the South Korean government and debt swaps from international lenders contained this financial crisis. And by the first quarter of 1999, things were starting to improve. By the end of 1999, GDP growth had risen to an impressive 10.5%, back on track. During the 90s, South Korean officials and manufacturers planned a significant shift in future production plans towards high-tech markets and industries. This resulted in the focus we see today, like massive companies, Samsung and LG, showing such great success out of Korea in the international market. This shift, however, did not have a dead-founding impact on the heavy industries such as car, ship and machinery assembly, which was such a strong part of the Korean economy. I was lucky enough to see car plants and shipyards on the southern coast of South Korea last year, and they truly are spectacular. Stuff's just getting pushed out and pushed out. It's amazing. Like most industrialised economies, Korea suffered significant setbacks during the global downturn that began in 2007. Annual growth in the economy slowed to 2.3% in 2008 and was expected to drop to negative 4.5%, but South Korea was able to limit the downturn to a near standstill of 0.2% in 2009. Despite the global financial crisis, the South Korean economy, helped by stimulus measures from the government and strong domestic consumption of products that compensated for the drop in exports, the country was able to avoid a recession. Unlike most industrialized economies, South Korea posted positive economic growth, although very small, for 2 consecutive years during the crisis. South Korea over the past 4 decades has demonstrated incredible growth and global integration to become a high-tech industrial economy that it is today. In the 1960s, GDP per capita was comparable to countries, the poorest of the poor in Africa and Asia. Now, in the 2000s, South Korea has joined the $1 trillion club of world economies. A feat that can truly be summed up as the Korean miracle.